So should we start?
It's, hello. Hello.
If all the presenters are there, we can start.
The first presenter is here.
You can begin, Arsha.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 3, session 8 of the online international seminar titled Translation as Reconstitution, Issues of Self, Canon, History and Memory in India, organized by the Department of Translation Studies, the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. This session, titled Marginal Identities in Translation, is chaired by Dr. Anand Mahanand. I would like to say a few words about Anand sir. Dr. Anand Mahanand is a professor in the Department of Materials Development, Testing and Evaluation at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. His research interests are in the areas of studies in English and ELT. His important books include English Through Folktales, English for Academic and Professional Skills, Imagining the Other, Representation of Tribal India in Fiction, Local Knowledge, Perceptions on Dalit and Tribal Literature, and Literature for Language Skills. He has translated 2 collections of folktales and 2 collections of short stories. He has translated texts by Ruskin Bond, Gopinath Mohanty, and Pradipha Ray. He is the executive editor of a peer-reviewed online international journal called Lokartha, devoted to folklore, language, literature, and pedagogy. Welcome to the session, sir.
Thank you very much.
Before we start, we have 4 presentations in this session, each of 20 minutes. The presenters are kindly requested to complete their presentations within the stipulated time, that is 15 to 20 minutes. And we'll take the questions towards the end of the session, after all the 4 presentations are done. Hope you all have a great day. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the lovely presentation, introduction. At the outset, I would like to thank my colleagues in the Department of Translation Studies and the scholars and all organizers for this opportunity. I would like to give a very brief introduction, then we'll proceed. Translation is not merely transference of language from one to the other, but it is transference of culture. It involves interplay of identities. We have the identity of the source text, then the identity of the translated text, identity of the author, identity of the translator, and identity of the reader. So translation, culture, and identity are significant aspects. Hence, the session is devoted to culture and identity in the context of translation. And we have 4 papers dealing with different aspects of these themes. As it is mentioned, each presenter will get 20 minutes, and at the end, we will take up the questions and discussion. So I welcome the paper presenters and the distinguished audience. Now I would like to request Pratisha Patel to read her paper or present her paper. Pratisha Patel is a research scholar in the Department of English, MS University of Baroda, and the topic of her presentation is Meaning, Consciousness, and the Negotiation of Cultural Identity in Translation, a study of Adiwati poetry. Over to you, Patricia.
Very good afternoon to all of you. As I am connected through my phone, so is there any difficulty to listening to me or anything? Just let me know. So I'll share my screen. So is my screen is visible to you, or my PPT is visible to everyone?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes,
am I
we can
audible now? Okay. So I am a Pratiksha Patel. I am doing research at Maharaja Sahajirao University of Baroda. Also, I am doing my research in indigenous literature of Australia and indigenous literature of Gujarat, where I am looking the question of land and settlement. For that reason, I have made this paper. So I would like to start my paper with introducing my title is a meaning, consciousness, and the negotiation of cultural identity in translation, a study of Adiwati poetry. So if you talk about the translation has a different context. In Western, it has a different context, and if you talk about translation in Indian perspective, it has a different history. But we do not have the clear idea of translation in a context of tribal literature. How do we translate tribal literature, and how do we see tribal culture in translation, and how do we see translation through the okay, is my screen visible? Hello.
It used to be visible, not now.
Not now.
Okay. So, and if you talk about, and if I'll talk about identity, it has a different history altogether. So, as of now, I restrict myself to not talk about the history of translation and not the history of identity, because identity has a different context and a different time of period of time. And also, identity has a different meaning in the present. So, I will restrict myself to only talking about tribal identity in the context of Gujarat through the lens of translation. So, the first question I would like to begin with the question that why do we need tribal literature in translation? So I have a question, all of you, that how many of you have read tribal poems, and how many of you have remember any tribal poems? So we all remember the Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and other poems in regional languages to our grandmothers and in school, but we do not have any clue about tribal poems or tribal any story, because it is not there in the part of an academic. So that's why we don't, and there is the need of tribal literature in translation, where we, the research scholars, are engaging with the question of tribal identity through the lens of translation. So the clear objective of my study is to question of how translation has shaped modern day dispute over tribal identity. Historically, it can be argued that translation will provide a fresh perspective on tribal literature and tribal identity. The paper also I have a better understanding of the question of tribal identity through the lens of translation. It is possible to imagine the question of tribal literature in India without translation. What forms of identity could emerge as a result of the translating process? The objective of this study is to examine what kind of cultural representation has been achieved through the translating process. The major goal of this study is to investigate how the act of translation affects the cultural identities of the tribes in Gujarat. Without a doubt, translation brings the voiceless voices of tribal people to the forefront, but it also negotiates tribal consciousness in present-day Gujarat through the translation, because tribals are in Gujarat are constantly constantly changing and then acquiring new kind of identity in present day of Gujarat. The article also focuses on the Gujarati Adivasi literature or Adivasi poems composed in their native tongue and subsequently translated into English or Gujarati. I chose Jitendra Vasawa. He lives in Mahupada district of Gujarat. It's called Narmada. He used to write a poetry on his own region. He represents his own community. He is also asserting the question of land settlement and the disadvantages and the struggle that Adivasis are facing in the Gujarat. He also, through his poetry, also shows the relationship between translation and tribal identity. The study considers the loss of memory and rhythm in the translating process, as well as the reconstructed sense of tribal identity that emerges in the translation. So I'm reading this poem only because of this poem is clearly gives the real world view or real tribal situations in Gujarat. the poem titled Living and Dying in a Foreign Tongue, which he clearly refers to the English language, translated from the Dahiwali to Bhili by Gopika Jareda. So I would like to read this poem. The language that was at home in the air and stepped into our blood with the thread of grandma's story in the dark night. Through the forest, river, field, astride grandma's shoulder, the language that entered within through the eyes, the language of the field of the morsel of a food chewed and fed by the mother, the living language of the family neighborhood blazed into my fingers and twinned with my father's at festival time. The language alive in the family quarter village. Everyone lives as a one, dances, sings, works as one. The sorrow of a one is the sorrow of all. Our language that takes us to these higher paths could not even climb the threshold of the schoolhouse. I sat alone in the school while our tongue is outside without like a dog. The master said, I don't speak in our language. I was scared and could not ask, why can I not speak our tongue? Who forced that foreign tongue into our master's mouth? From 10 to 5 p.m. during the day, I sat on the iris, like the deep darkness of the darkness night. At later, it made its way into through the eyes. At times, as it possessed, it forces its way into my body through my fingers, forcing its way through the lashes of the finger's green stick, that foreign tongue, proving us uncaught night and day. It tries to civilize us, how to rule over each other, letting us live. It feels that language teaches how teeming mid-bazaar to snatch the fruit of someone else's labor. It leaves us living dead, that foreign language. So this poem clearly gives a overview of tribal community, that the arrival of the English language had affected in their life, that they are lost in their grandma's story, the whole literature. The tribal literature is all about songs, stories that passes from one generation to another generation, younger generation, from this certainly from the grandparents to the younger generation, which is losing because of the language that is used to teach in a school, which is different, and the language that is used to spoken in the home. The area, the poem is also talk about, gives the voice of the we. The sorrow of all is sorrow of one is sorrow of all. It gives the community, whole community he is trying to represent throughout his language. He is also asserting for this poem that the language is lives as a dead because of the foreign language, that we are losing our cultural identity through our language. Okay, so I am not going to give you the whole introduction about what tribal culture is and what tribal literature is all about. So you can see the images through which we can find that the tribal literature from the dated back to from present is been negotiated and invisible, and it also not included in academia. And now it's in 20th century. Tribal literature is all of the everyday experience of tribal communities and their ongoing struggle for a land. Many research scholars are nowadays engaging the question of tribal literature, why they have their voices negotiated, why they are not represented. So this is how modern scholars are doing the research in the assertion of tribal identity. Tribal literature shared a collective memory and an infusion of imagination from the past and the present. So tribal literature, we can say the tribal literature is ongoing literature because it's very much related to culture, and tribal culture is very, very, very rich, diverse in language, diverse in customs. They have a very, very different idea than we see when we read in text. So the question is the invisibility of tribal literature. Why tribal literature is invisible to us? The origin of all written literature can be traced as oral forms of literature. This is the case. How we can describe tribal literature is predominantly oral rather than written. The obscurity of tribal literature or tribal art in the history of Indian literature, the tribal language and literature have been completely negotiated only because of the rich tribal culture and diversity of language, mainly oral. Only because the one thing that I have understood is tribal literature has been negotiated and not understood because of the language and because they are living in the forest areas. Now the scenario is changed. Now they are living in the city. They are they are acquiring education. They are getting good job, good position. They are now able to write for and represent their own voice through the medium of literature or any other resources. The oral forms of tribal literature have no script or written record. Thus, they are invisible. Then another reason is the invisibility of tribal literature is the hegemony of the Sanskrit language. We cannot find any text in our Indian history or Indian literature because of the hegemony of Sanskrit language. However, I contend that the lack of script or standard language is Gujarati and English in present day of Gujarat, and also in earlier time is a Sanskrit, Gujarati, Pali, and Prakrit, and all that. So standard language. So it also arises the question of what do we call standard language in defining tribal literature? Does not allow one to separate the entire tribal society and its rich culture. Okay, the next. But later part of the early part of the 20th century, that G.N. Devi has started a survey where he very much concerned about what tribal languages are, urge of a distinct they are losing if one loses their language. If in consideration of tribal, they have their own language, their culture, and they are very much connected through language and culture, and which represent tribal identity in Gujarat. So where do we see tribal variety if we examine Indian literature, which is multilingual and multicultural view of Indian history? They made the argument that we can't study Indian literature unless we know tribal language and literature, which is rich, multicultural, full of customs and beliefs. So how do we define the mainstream notion of Indian knowledge without knowledge of this tribal culture and language? I agree with Davis' proposal that one cannot deny the tribal literature, which is very much rich in the tradition and culture. If anyone is studying Indian literature, which is very much invisible from present, and now it's emerged as a very much research emerged as in a research academia. Indian languages have script. There is the Indian literatures have a script. That is, they are considered language and tribal languages as words of extinction. Okay. Then I am not going to defining what translation is and what the history of translation and what is the Western scholars. Yes, I have made this point in my PPT with calligraphy, where Rita Kothari says that the translation is a very much an everyday process. If we are preferring Rita Kothari translation very much everyday process, then how can we forget tribal literature, which is very much everyday life? Which is also talks about the represent real issues, which is the land and settlement and urbanization in Gujarat. In translation, in my opinion, is a very complex and challenging procedure until and unless we are acknowledgers of another culture and language. I argue that translation is not a static as we find in Western scholarship. It keep on acquiring meaning throughout its reader. I believe that translation open up a space for reader to critique it or give information about the text. It depends on the reader's background, politics behind the reading, and ideology. Okay, so we are not going to read this. Okay, so translation and tribal literature, we can find the relationship between what kind of relationship the translation and tribal literature share in the existence of tribal literature. Throughout the history, no translation was accessible for the tribal literature. The question may arise as in which language tribal literature should be translated, and who has right to translate, and what is the perception of author, and to understand the perception of tribal. It is translation that pushes tribal orality and literature to the fore. How does one visualize a tribal world while sitting on a couch? I personally believe that translation opens up the new possibilities to bring forefront to the tribal literature and offers a new possibility for the research and preserving of tribal culture and tribal literature. According to G.N. Devi, the emergence of a print technology had an impact on tribal languages and oral became ambiguous. We can see the general disregard for tribal culture and languages that have remained outside of a print technology. An Indian perspective, translation is an aesthetic and ideological challenge, which he used to illustrate with the example of literary history. He suggests that in order to translate, literary communities with translating consciousness must address the subject of the root of literary translation differently. In one of his articles called "Translation and Theory History in Indian Perspective," he was giving his own views. So translation, no doubt, it allows to understand and gain knowledge of Indian rich tribal culture, which has been focus of academic research. According to Nissan Choksi, he is also working on tribal literature in Gujarat. Translation becomes a mean for boosting tribal voice in their own well-being. It also permits both political and cultural voices to be heard in the process of articulating their own ambition in a democratic state. Kuchamadani also says that indigenous tribal literature is entirely negotiated by the upper caste society from the standpoint of standard language. Gujarati is the dominating language in Gujarat, and nowadays it is English and Gujarati both. However, I contend that
you conclude. conclude your paper, please.
Okay. I'll just read the scope for the further research. Okay. Scope for the further research. In this study, various internal factors like the tribal perspective, attitude toward Western culture, interconnection with other cultures were not analyzed. That will provide a new research scope for further study. Interpretation of tribal terminology in a present scenario that should be evaluated for further exploration. To summarize, translation can provide a fresh perspective from which we can interpret and learn about the communities, and the framework of translation determines tribal identity. Along with this, I request that additional research be conducted on my behalf to learn more about how tribal literature may be translated to express tribal identity in Gujarat. Existing tribes and their cultures have been impacted by numerous construction projects, causing them to be displaced and research for their true identity. In this circumstance, we may suppose that they have lost their cultural meaning. It is impossible for the translator to portray actual tribal cultural identity to the audience or the reader. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pratiksha. Next presenter is Dr. P. Sambhu.
Good afternoon, sir. Am I audible enough?
Yes, and he comes from NSS College, Pandalam, Kerala, and the topic of his presentation is the politics of translation, the politics of translating subaltern texts, an analysis of Arun Prabha Mukherjee's translation of Jutan. Over to you, Sambhu.
Thank you, sir. So the title of my presentation is The Politics of Translating Subaltern Texts, an analysis of Arun Prabha Mukherjee's translation of Jutan. So the present paper attempts to examine Arun Prabha Mukherjee's translation of Pragueraj Valmiki's autobiography, Jutan, which recounts in stark detail the subhuman existence of the Chura community against the backdrop of Walter Benjamin's notion of translatability. The paper will delve into the politics of language that renders context bound by the specificity of culture, pervious to shared understanding, analyze the relationship between knowledge and power as laid out by Michel Foucault, and also try to evaluate the extent to which Mukherjee's translation holds up in the light of Benjamin's theory of translation. It argues that Mukherjee's translation of Jutan has not only succeeded in transplanting the author's and by extension an entire community's identity crisis into a totally different language, but also accomplished it in a manner that has not compromised the stylistic and aesthetic elements of the source text. The translations of Dalit texts often tend to be lopsided when it comes to striking a balance between radicalizing the issue at hand and expressing the author's concerns in a language that enshrines the verbal nuances of the original. But in this case, that has hardly been an issue, and Mukherjee's efforts can be seen to lie in the right direction. Pragueraj Valmiki is a Dalit writer whose entire life bears testimony to the malady of caste hierarchies. As a child growing up in his village, as a schoolboy, and as an employee, he had to confront the stigma of being a Dalit. In his autobiography, Jutan, he narrates the life of the Chura community existing precariously at the bottom of the caste ladder. It records for the first time in South Asian literary history the plight of the Chura community, which is forced on account of its low caste status to sweep roads, cleanse cattle sheds, bury animal carcasses, and perform every other menial job dictated by the upper caste in the village of Barla in Muzaffarnagar, Uttar Pradesh. In speaking about the inequities foisted on his community by the elite classes, Valmiki also recounts his unswerving struggle to surmount physical as well as mental exploitation through education as championed by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Throughout the book, Valmiki describes with breathtaking authenticity the exclusionary practices resorted to by the upper caste to keep the Dalits confined to the margins of the social order. When he says that, and I quote, "The moment they," that is the upper caste, "find out your caste, everything changes," unquote, he communicates the suddenness with which the revelation of one's low caste status can consign one to perpetual stigmatization. Valmiki's choice of the autobiography as a genre to articulate his voice of protest is deliberate. The autobiographical narration allows him to become the representative of all the other Dalits who have been equally oppressed and denied opportunities. Unlike other autobiographies where the authorial voice takes the center stage, Dalit autobiography is based on the idea of communal identity. Here, the author does not diminish into the role of a narcissistic I, but acts as a cultural adhesive that brings together the heterogeneous voices of the community. This process of ensuring harmony between the author's objectives and those of the people facilitate a continuum between the representer and the represented. It is for this reason that Arun Prabha Mukherjee begins her introduction to Judan, extolling Valmiki's decision to write an autobiography that will change Dalit literature forever. In the succeeding paragraphs of the introduction, she lays bare the motivation behind her decision to translate a text that several other caste-conscious translators might have shunned for fear of the imputations articulated by Valmiki striking too close to home. She states that it was because the autobiography did not mince words in indicting the Brahminical community, of which she herself is a member, for the traumatization of the Dalit psyche, that she was able to relate to the text. Mukherjee's upbringing in a conservative town in North India, where she encountered Dalits engaged in a plethora of menial jobs like cleaning out latrines of the upper caste members and carrying the excrement on their heads, had such an impact upon her that when she read Valmiki's autobiography, it was as though she was listening to the narrativization of a most abject form of cruelty that had conveniently been elided over by mainstream society for so long. Speaking of the trajectory that her process of translation has followed, Mukherjee says that her entry into the translator's role was occasioned by the disheartening repetitiveness of the colonizer-colonized dialectic schema she encountered in almost every account of post-colonial literature from South Asia. Since becoming aware of Dalit literature and its rallying cry for social justice, Mukherjee was perplexed by the apathy, exclusivity, and brazen indifference with which mainstream writers continued to pander to populist ideologies when they should actually be intervening actively on behalf of marginalized communities. The issue of caste generated not only scant response among the intelligentsia, and when it did, it was conveniently hushed in favor of more high-sounding topics. It was quite accidentally that Mukherjee stumbled upon Valmiki's text, and even then it was more out of a sense of moral necessity to alert herself to the injustices suffered by the Dalits than out of any professional ambition that she began translating it. When the dream of a book-length translation took root in her mind, she started discussing the need to place Valmiki's work in the context of the other's global fight for freedom with Sharan Kumar Limbale, another Dalit author, who gave her the necessary inspiration to take Valmiki's text to a wider audience. Mukherjee confesses that her translation attempts to serve a didactic as well as a transformative function. For those who are largely unaware of the systemic violence and oppression faced by the Dalits in India, the book will surely be an initiation into the dark underbelly of caste, and to those who choose to connive at the sufferings of the Dalits while reaping the benefits accruing from being a stakeholder in society, the book will be an eye-opener. However, one must not, when taken into confidence by the self-affirmative tone of the translation, hesitate to ask the most pertinent question here. Can the subaltern speak? In raising Gayatri Spivak's famous question in this context, we are fundamentally trying to probe whether the translatability of the text allows of a near one-to-one correspondence between the Dalit authors and the non-Dalit translators' intentionality. In other words, is a translator putting words into the mouth of the author and thereby speaking on his behalf, or is she an impartial conduit for the strident protest voiced by the author? If the first proves to be true, then the present translation is nothing more than an addendum to the litany of well-minded but flawed attempts to channel subaltern sentiments, and if the latter is the case, then the translation, instead of committing what Spivak calls epistemic violence, is one that nudges its textual machinery into the background in favor of the author's true voice. In responding to Spivak's question, Mukherjee answers that she has translated Judan as her contribution to making that space of autonomy available to a Dalit writer to proclaim his identity without the distorting filter of an upper caste consciousness. She argues that elite Indian voices, whether in India or in diaspora, continue to represent the Indian voice, and that it is time that this monopoly was ruptured and other voices heard. Can be seen that Mukherjee's translation guides us smoothly into the exigency of the Dalit voice with its searing pain, resentment, and reformative zeal. The translation also disabuses the reader of any illusion of homogeneity in the problems faced by Dalits all over India and streamlines its critique, the oppression faced by the author himself and the Jura community in particular. In his remarkable essay, The Task of the Translator, Walter Benjamin argues that beyond the communicable, there remains in all languages and its construction something incommunicable, which is depending on the context in which it is encountered, either symbolizing or symbolized. Symbolized, however, in the development of languages themselves, unquote. What Benjamin means by the inherent incommunicability of a language is the aspects of its cultural repertoire that are not fully amenable to translation. Although these aspects become manifest in the source text only in a symbolic manner, their presence is, however, subtly affirmed. But in a translation, such subtleties are hard to capture. It is this innate untranslatability, or the extent to which a text resists being recast in another language, that serves as a benchmark for the translatability of a text. These seemingly contradictory poles of meaning complement each other in establishing a pure language, that is, a hypothetical plane of meaning, where the mutually exclusive differences between two languages can coexist harmoniously in their striving to transcend each other's inadequacies of representation. Benjamin's argument that translation is not merely about transmitting messages finds its echo in Mukherjee's competent rendering of Judin. Her translation attempts to embody a pure language by asserting the a priori kinship of all languages. She conveys the tenor of the original as much as possible in the translation by recourse to a mix of innovative techniques and by adopting hybridization and heterogeneity as her guiding principles. Speaking of the role played by language in translations, Mukherjee writes in the essay, Translating Minoritized Cultures, Issues of Caste, Class, and Gender Language, that, and I quote, language is the skin of culture, the surface where inside touches outside and self encounters another, unquote. In Judin, it can be seen that language becomes a site where cultural interactions take place and where different vectors of power intersect. Mukherjee's translation, rather than being a mere shadow of the original, reproduces the intentionality of the author. As Benjamin says, it fashions in its own language a counterpart to the original's mode of intention in order to make both of them recognizable as fragments of their vessel, as fragments of a greater language, unquote. One of the greatest merits of Mukherjee's translation is its unwillingness to play down what translators in general might consider the more unpleasant and lurid aspects of the text. As such, she makes no attempt to diffuse the threat to elitist morality represented by Valmiki's depictions of the upper caste women defecating in the open space adjoining the Chura households. Whereas such a base act does not constitute a form of decency for the upper caste women, Valmiki's questioning of its legitimacy through his narrative delivers a decisive blow to their presumption that Dalits are supposed to live in a feculent environment. By choosing not to mitigate the horror and revulsion generated by such episodes, Mukherjee can be seen to aid Valmiki in demolishing the bulwarks of upper caste authority. This fidelity to that source text thus gives the reader a panoramic view of the inequities of the caste system with no unnecessary embellishments of language mitigating its stark reality. Mukherjee's translation of Judin in a manner consistent with the tone of the original is no mean feat, considering the incompatibility between Hindi and English. Since most of the techno-scientific and cultural developments of the preceding century have taken place in the West, and since material changes are reflected in language too, English has progressed quickly through a pre-capitalist to a consumerist phase with a protean vocabulary suited to representing the multifariousness of this change. On the other hand, Hindi, being an Indian language, still retains a culture-specific vocabulary, most of which is not easily translatable into a fluxive language like English. What this means is that while there are no proper English equivalents for certain Hindi words corresponding to cultural practices or artifacts that have no counterparts in the West, Several English words for which there are no indigenous equivalents have also been assimilated as such into Hindi for lack of a better alternative. The task of the translator as such becomes intensely complicated. It becomes a balancing act in which the translator has to resist the lure of convenience that dictates the use of set expressions, leading to a distortion of the original sense, and also of extreme fidelity in which the translation is hamstrung by the redundance of indigenous expressions. Mukherjee seems to have surmounted such linguistic difficulties by resorting to a form of translation that does not detract from the authenticity of the original, even as it embraces the stylistic integrity of English. The title of the translation itself is a case in point. Instead of using leftovers, Mukherjee decided to stick with the original, that is Juden, since the word is deeply rooted in the Dalit psyche as a marker of all the pain and humiliation that they have suffered. While leftovers might have signified the exclusionary ideology of the Pragueraj, it might in no way have communicated the trauma it engendered in the Dalits. In translations targeted at an international audience, or for that matter, a pan-Indian audience, it is not unheard of for editors to change the book title in line with the sensibilities of a Western readership. Though Mukherjee was apprehensive that the title might be changed to untouchable, since that is a word that has already struck a chord with European and African scholars, the editorial decision to keep Juden as a title was not changed. To elucidate the importance Mukherjee attaches to the title Juden, a passage from the autobiography can be reproduced here. And I quote, "During weddings, when the guests and the baratis, those who had accompanied the bridegroom as members of the party, were eating their meals, the churas would sit outside with huge baskets. After the bridegroom's party had eaten, the dirty petals or leaf plates were put in the churas' baskets, which they took home to save the juden that was sticking to them. The little remains of puris, puffed bread, bits of sweetmeats, and a little bit of vegetable were enough to make them happy. They ate the juden with a lot of relish." Juden is not just leftover. It is what remains after the Pragueraj have had their fill. The little morsels of food that the Chura community salvages after the elite classes have satisfied their hunger serve as a metaphor for the rights of Dalits being downgraded into the status of residues left over from the Brahminical classes, the classes that enjoy all their privileges. Michel Foucault's power knowledge paradigm can be invoked here to understand the consequences of editorial decisions that wear down the authenticity of the translation. Foucault contends that the interpenetration of the power knowledge paradigm establishes regimes of truth that discipline the social body in ways deemed correct by the dominant orders. And I speak this in relation to two competing translations of Juden, one by Columbia Press and one by Sri Samya Books. The Columbia edition naturalizes the vestiges of Valmiki's coarseness surviving in Mukherjee's translation to create a polished text along the lines of Western sensibility. By exercising such controls, the editors lose the larger point of the translation, which is to allow the original intention of the author to be heard. One of the best examples of Mukherjee's competence as a translator is the effortlessness with which he renders the village scene the autobiography opens with. Quite contrary to conventional Hindi novels that guide the reader through idyllic spectacles, Juden plunges the reader right into the thick of gross biological functions to disabuse the reader's sensibilities of any hints of romanticism. And although she uses words like Bua, Masi, Bahu, Chacha, Chachi, and Mausa instead of coming up with makeshift English equivalents. This policy is followed whenever and wherever Mukherjee encounters a word in the original that can be translated with only some detriment to its semantic core. As such, the translation is characterized by the preponderance of words like Chandala, Gunda, Savarna, etc. over their English equivalents, which sometimes sound more sophisticated and therefore inadequate. And there are also instances where Valmiki's prose remains several notches above the translation. Valmiki's diction, though very simple and direct, has an undertow of satire and resentment. While this seeps out naturally in the original, in the English translation, the same effect is very difficult to produce. Through the innovative use of diction and syntax, Valmiki unleashes his diatribe against his teachers village heads, and even other self-righteous Hindi writers for vilifying Dalits. Valmiki uses simple words to communicate profound sentiments, and never once does his prose lean in favor of syntactic virtuosity when he can find a more direct expression. This strategy of communicating searing experiences using simple sentences makes the writing feel at once raw and intimate.
Please conclude your paper.
Yes, sir, I will conclude right now. And so in conclusion, and it can be said that Mukherjee's translation, even while falling short of the original in places, especially in maintaining the distinction between different kinds of register and reproducing slang expressions in English, lives up to the original in terms of authenticity of emotion. She even outdoes Valmiki when it comes to ratcheting up the intensity of the language and not shying away from what is traditionally labeled as profanities. Considering the chiasmal divide between English and Hindi, she has done a commendable job, one that does not leave a lot to be desired. The most redeeming aspect of the translation is the use of expressions borrowed from Hindi like abe, achureka, and so on to create a visceral effect. Finally, the translation attests to what Mukherjee herself has said about the role of the translator of Dalit text in an interview. And I quote, "If a Dalit writer is an activist, I would say that the translator is also an activist. My journey to the point of becoming a translator of Juden is the journey of coming into consciousness about the unjust social order and my place in it." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sabbo. It was a well-structured and well-researched paper, and very interesting. Very interesting. Now we shall go to the next presentation, and the next presentation is by Dr. P. Samatha, Assistant Professor and Head, Department of English, Telangana University, Nizamabad. And the title of her presentation is Reflecting Cultural Expression, Navigating Through the Challenges of Translation. Over to you, Dr. Samatha.
Good afternoon to all of you, the chair, the other teachers from the department, and my co-presenters and other participants of the session. I wish you a very good afternoon. This is one of my maiden presentations in this area of translations. Based on one of the translations I did myself, a short story. And this is just a reflection of the paper, and I'm putting forward what I have undergone when I was translating the paper. And I would like to make a proposal to the department at EFLU towards the conclusion of my my presentation. So I'd like to share my screen. So I have titled my paper as Reflecting Cultural Expression, Navigating Through Challenges of Translation. It's a case study of a short story translated from Telugu to English. So as we all are aware, as we all know, language and culture are the two inseparable elements of any community, and literature reflects both these aspects, that is language and culture. And that is how a reader is initiated to follow and understand the world around. But then the readership undergoes a potential challenge when a translated text is read, which could not embark accurately the cultural expression of the text in source language to the target language. So while I was reflecting on the paper, I was I was reading some of the theories, and one of the theories and one of the study that helped me is Mona Baker's, in her other words, she expresses saying that source language word may express a concept which is totally unknown in the target culture. It can be abstract or concrete. It may be a religious belief, a social custom, or even a type of food. And in her book, in other words, she argued about the common non-equivalence to which a translator comes across while translating from source language to target language, while both languages have their distinguished specific culture. So she puts them in the following order. Culture-specific concepts, then the source language concept, which is not lexicalized in target language, then the source language word, which is semantically complex. The source and target languages make different distinction in meaning. The target language lacks a superordinate. The target language lacks a specific term such as hyponym. And there are differences in physical or interpersonal perspective, differences in expressive meaning, differences in form, differences in frequency and purpose of using specific forms, the use of loan words in the source text. So the list goes on. And I will not go much into other parts of distinguishing between language, culture, and how both of them are interrelated. I will directly go to the work which I did. This is about the text that is translated. This text is a short story that was published in Andhra Jyoti, a Telugu daily, with the title Manasija Villu, written by a Telugu writer and activist Pingali Chaitanya, and which I translated as Cupid's Bow with the permission of the author. The story in brief is there is a young protagonist, a housewife enjoying the bliss of married life, who suddenly finds herself in such a situation where she tries to search for her husband in the body of her husband himself. She realizes that the person who is with her as her husband, though looks like him by face, is not him. The body is not his. She recalls all those instances where she finds that his hands and legs suddenly became new to her, and therefore makes up her mind to go into the forest to question Betal and King Vikramarka, who are the source of her problem. Finally, when she reaches them, she reminds them that Betal in his 6th story posed a problem to the king, which was answered by the king too, and because of which she is suffering right now. The story that was narrated to King Vikramarka by Betal is the story of Hayavadana, which we are all very well familiar with. But the characters are a Dhobi and his wife and a friend of Dhobi. It so happens that their bodies get exchanged when the wife accidentally mixes up their heads, when Devi gives her a boon of life to them, as they have sacrificed themselves by beheading their heads at her feet. And so when Betal poses a question to Vikramarka, as with whom should the wife go, Vikramarka answers him saying that she should go with one whose head is her husband's head. Betal is satisfied with the answer and gets disappeared. And then it's the turn of the protagonist of the story to ask Betal that he and the king may have been satisfied at the conclusion of the story, but she's suffering as she is not satisfied by the body of her husband. And she vehemently states that she wants that person who has the body of her husband. The story ends in a very interesting way, rather doesn't end at all, as Betal tries to explain and convince her, saying that she is one of the characters of his story, but he himself and the King Vikramarka are the characters of somebody else. So she neither can question him nor is able to give her any answer or solve her problem. But the lady is not willing to accept this explanation of Betal and therefore walks away, saying that she is going to write her destiny herself, and that is, she is choosing the one who has body of her husband. And as she walks past it and turns back to Betal and Vikramarka at the threshold of a twist of another story and not finding them behind her, though they both tried to stop her, were unable to keep up with her pace, and therefore she laughs. The rationale for the translation of this story to English is, the story intrigued me to a great extent. I started to recall the parallel structure in the storyline. One is Hayavadana, a very famous play by Girish Karnad, published in the year 72. and The Transposed Heads, a novella originally written in German in 1940 by Thomas Mann, published in the same year, and which was later translated into English by H.T. Lowe Porter, which was published in 1941. The story is set in India, retells of an ancient folk legend in a very light-hearted way. The source for this work by Thomas Mann is Katha Sarit Sagara, which is an old Sanskrit collection of stories. Mann used mock heroic tone to tell the story, whereas Karnad focuses on the incompleteness, twisting relations, humanity, and the dark nature of humans to tell the story. Almost after 5 decades, another short story in Telugu on similar lines appeared. The way the theme is dealt and the story that is narrated in terms of different compositions structurally is bound to become another paper for research. This paper is restricted only to the study of various challenges that it posed during translation due to vast differences in cultural expressions. So the study posed me these problems. Sorry. Yeah, the problems that were encountered are sorry, I might.
You're not able to read it?
No, 1 second. So my window suddenly got stuck up, sir.
Don't worry.
The problems that were encountered are failure to achieve the equivalence in the second language, that is cultural expressions, and
Go to the previous slide. It has the points.
yes, sir.
I can read for you.
Yeah, sir.
And we can explain. The previous slide. That one, yeah, 10. Just click on 10. No.
Yes. So the first problem I encountered was failure to achieve the equivalence in the second language, which is definitely cultural expressions. I found problem, and then I had problem with challenges of onomatopoeia, and there was ambiguity of some cultural expressions, that is idiomatic expressions. And of course, I have to admit towards the end that lack of knowledge of translation techniques and translation strategies. There are some instances which are in front of you on the slide, something like this. Telugu expressions followed by the way I translated. Poyilo manta. I could not get the word equivalent to poyi. I could not show it. Fire was dwindling down in the stove. Kasinni chedalu pattina taatakulni guttuga. A bunch of dried palm leaves affected white ants. So I could not get the word for chedapattina. Aame chuttintlo vanta chestundi. Chuttintlo is a word which I could not get the word, and it could not reflect actually the culture there. Cooking in the portion marked for the traditional kitchen, chuttinti churulo from the lintel of chuttillu, and the vein of the leaves, kanakambaralu kuda antukunnai. The veins of the leaves and the broken crosandras also started catching. So the list goes on like this. I have another slide also with the list of the expressions, which I could not get the flavor. I could not reflect the cultural aspect here. So here Peter Newmark's theory of translation and the strategies he proposed came into my aid. They are some of the aspects, some of the strategies we are all aware of, like naturalization, a strategy when a source language word is transferred into target language text in its original form. And there is neutralization, which is a kind of paraphrasing at the level of word. Thereby, the word is neutralized with using with some culture-free words. And then we have descriptive and functional equivalence. That is, in explanation of source language, cultural item, there are two elements. One is at the descriptive level, and the other is at the functional level, reflecting the size, color, and composition. I have other examples which to show you. And then finally, explanation as footnote. The translator, where wishes to give extra information to the target language reader, he would explain this extra information in a footnote. It may come at the bottom of the page, at the end of the chapter, or end of the book. So I had to take the help of these strategies. And there are some of challenges of onomatopoeia. The words like daba daba, which I had to just say, she quickly went along. And then there were sounds of tinkling of those dried leaves in the stove when she puts it, tapa, dubu, chitapata. So these effects I could not reflect again. And then there was ambiguity of some cultural expressions like talemo tatikayanta, ollemo pitta periganta. So the head is as big as a palm fruit and the body as small as a small fish. It was like didactic kind of presentation in the translation. So I could not do that. How does the rice cook if the characters revolt? Patra, Gangalamlo, Chembukatulu. Don't tell me stories like character and ear in the jar. So I'd like to end my presentation here. So the conclusion, I mean, with a very I would like to propose to the department saying that language and culture are certainly to be reflected in the translation. And though there are many theories which were proposed, but there's still a gap when the actual practical part is coming into, especially translators, amateur translators like me. I was very much interested. I wanted to publish this, and I mean, keeping that intention in my mind, I officially went to the writer and I took permission. I could do it, but then I still feel that I'm falling short of the translation exactly reflecting what exactly the author did. So I feel that there should be a methodology to help and train the translators, probably some kind of diploma courses or certificate courses if the department comes forward to help people who are interested in this field. That would be a great help. So with this proposal, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Character writing, another story, and that story was really very fascinating. And also you shared your experience of translating these texts, and you have also suggested some measures, I'm sure, with the advice and consultation of translators around, you'll be able to solve some of your problems. The next presentation is by Snigdha Sudrasmita, and she is a research scholar in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Roorkee. And her paper is titled Translating the Ill Body, Reconstitution of Self and Identity in Lisa Rice's Close. Over to you, Snigdha.
Okay, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Is my slide visible?
Yes, we can see your slide. Good.
Okay, sir. My video is visible, I think. Sir, am I audible? Is my video visible?
Yeah, it is on. You are audible, and the slide also is visible. Please go ahead, don't worry.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm so happy to be here. My first presentation was in your class, English for academic purposes, in my first semester, and here we are. I can't say how happy I am, and Kokila ma'am is there, and everyone is there. This is like my people and my place. Okay, so the topic for my presentation is translating the ill body, reconstitution of self and identity in Lisa Ray's Close to the Bone. I'm Snigdha. I'm a research scholar in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Roorkee. I work on medical humanities. Specifically, I work in the field of illness narratives. More specifically, I work on cancer memoirs by cancer survivors. And Lisa Ray's memoir is one such survivor narrative. So what are illness narratives? Illness narratives are the expression around the expressions about and around the experience of being ill. And they are stories which are narrated by the patients who become their own narrator and narrate their stories to reconstruct their self. These are intimate interpersonal process of writing narratives, and they write for expressions, revelations, and reflections. Now, coming to Lisa's memoir, Close to the Bone, as much as we may like to evade or minimize them, illness and disability inescapably attend human embodiment because we are all vulnerable subjects. So it might seem natural and inevitable that the most universal, the most democratic form of literature, autobiography and memoir, should address these common features of human experience. And writing critically about her illness in her memoir, Lisa forces us to examine the mortality and vulnerability our era prefers to deny. And this is a challenge that Lisa has met admirably in her memoir as a narrator and also as a protagonist. Now, coming to translation and medical humanities, we have all studied medical humanities, health humanities. We have heard about disability studies. How can translation and medical humanities go together? There is a need for a translational medical humanities approach which considers cultural and scientific factors as an integrated and intermingled process in the production and transmission of medical knowledge. This is what translational medical humanities believes. Medical humanities, instead of being seen as a segregated area, should be seen as a cross-disciplinary and cross-cultural space for a let's say, bi-directional critical interrogation of both biomedicine and the humanities. On the one hand, this implies breaking with the culture-nature dichotomy and considering both the humanities and medicine as biocultural practices. And on the other hand, it also implies understanding that boundary work requires boundaries and that incommensurability between various partial disciplinary perspectives can and will emerge. So this is an interdisciplinary space where both medicine and the humanities mutually challenge and inform each other. Now, medicine as an applied science has traditionally enjoyed a very, how do I put it, let's say a particularly authoritative and powerful status within the society, but the emerging discipline of health humanities with its focus on bringing the human back to health postulates that knowledge and practices drawn from the arts and humanities can directly enhance health and well-being rather than being utilized as tools in the training of medical professionals, as has been the case, for instance, in medical humanities. One such practice is that of storytelling, personal narratives and testimonies, blogs that we read about. Both health and medical humanities are increasingly acknowledging the role of personal narratives and testimonies in challenging, complementing, and contesting abstract expert knowledge. So studies on translational health humanities can also examine the production and dissemination of new knowledge regarding health and well-being through translations of personal narratives and testimonies in various areas. Like I'm working on cancer narratives, someone is working on mental health narratives, maternal and neonatal health narratives. So they focus on the co-creation of medical knowledge by and for lay people who cannot understand the narratives given by medical sciences. Now, when it comes to translate the ill body, we all have this question: why narrate pain and suffering? Why narrate illness? Why do we have to tell our story of illness? Is it for sympathy? Is it for testimony? Okay, so the ill self of the patient narrator makes an agential move to employ a parallel personal diagnosis of the ailing body that cannot be narrated or apprehended outside the colonizing tropes of medical science, because in the medical setup, in the clinical setup, the patient has no voice of his own. The patient is marginalized. So this narratives allows the patient narrator to regain some measure of control over his or her own story, identity, and self. This is what Lisa does. And all these things are threatened and disrupted by illness. Arthur Frank argues in his book, The Wounded Storyteller, that the ill person's distinctiveness as a storyteller is his illness. The body is not just the topic of the story, it is the condition of the narrator telling that story. The story is not just about illness, the story is told through a diseased body, and the body sets in motion the need for new stories when disease disrupts the old stories. The body, whether diseased or recovered, is simultaneously the cause, topic, and instrument of whatever new stories are told. The body is the translator, and the body is being translated into the narrative. Now, when it comes to narrate cancer, it's like narrating something which is unnarratable, because how do you narrate a body which is changing every day with every chemotherapy session, with every doctor visit? There are some changes in the body. So it's like narrating something which is unnarratable. How do you translate something which is not static, which is fluid and dynamic? And then again, there is this problem of the genesis of cancer, because it's a narrative, and because the narrator is trying to translate the ill body into a narrative. Narrative should have coherence, right? It should have beginning, middle, and end. So how does a person know where to start his or her story of cancer? In medical terms, they will say that your abnormal cells become malignant and then you have cancer in your body. But in our life, we cannot say, we cannot identify that particular oncogenesis moment where cancer cells invade your body. So all the narratives, like all the cancer memoirs or illness narrative that I have read, they try to identify a distinctive moment from their memory to narrate their story, so that they can have the beginning of their story. And Lisa says that the night I begin to step into myself, my shoes don't fit, everything keeps slipping from my fingers that morning. So she has to identify a particular morning, a particular night where her story starts, and everything keeps slipping from her fingers. And there is also this problem when one tries to translate the ill body for cancer patients. They do not know whether to call a particular sensation a symptom, a side effect, or a sign. Like narratologist Lomit Rimankenan says that illness narratives are an extreme test case, because you don't know where to start and where to end. So these are the problems which comes, or which one has to face when they are trying to narrate their own illness, and most specifically in chronic diseases. Lisa writes in her memoir, and I quote her, it's what we each do every day. We excavate our own lives to create stories, interpreting all kinds of things as science, or injecting meaning and lessons into the bleakest moments. She says about the importance of narrating her own story and translating her ill body. Later in the moonlit whirl of celebration, I found myself thinking about the importance of storytelling, about the stories that become anchors of faith, that support us and carry us both when we are lost and when we have found meaning. What do we do in the face of life's biggest upheavals and triumphs but make up stories? It's the way of our nature, and it's the way of metamorphosis, spinning gold out of the dark. Now, in a clinical setup, when Lisa goes to see her doctor, we'll read about the doctor-patient encounter which happens. There is this importance of cultural factors, which is very important when it comes to translation, because in translational health humanities, The clinical setup is seen as a place where two cultures meet together. The place where science is produced and not just the place of its reception forms a part of culture, and that the translation between the laboratory and society is a translation between different cultural places, not between universally valid science and local prejudice. Now coming to narrative medicine and translation. In the last few years, medical humanities has widened its scope to include critical and reflective factors, which offer an expanded framework for a more how do I put it, for a more proactive presence of the humanities and consequently of translation in the forging of medical and healthcare knowledge. Finally, I want to talk about narrative medicine, one of the main contributions of medical humanities, which is opening up a rich field to be mined for translation practice and research. Now, before that, what is narrative medicine? Narrative medicine is when the doctor is ready to listen to the narrative of the patient and the patient can tell the story to the doctor. Ritesh Sharon says, and I quote, as specialists in narrative medicine have long insisted, physicians need the ability to listen to the narratives of the patient, grasp and honor their meanings, and be moved to act on the patient's behalf. This is narrative competence, and it is the competence that human beings use to absorb, interpret, and respond to stories. Now, in Lisa's memoir, this is where she gets to know that she has cancer. Lisa writes, and I quote, 2 months ago, I had sat in a tiny supply closet of a room across from a jittery rabbit-faced doctor. He spoke very slowly, pausing a long time between each word as if to cause my reaction. You have multiple myeloma. The doctor reminded me of the rabbit in Alice in Wonderland. As he kicked me down the hole, he never said the word cancer. In fact, the signs in the clinic were vague, hematology center. But the pregnant pauses told me I was being inducted into a new club, fatal, paused, incurable, sorry. So this is how she translates the pauses of the doctor, and this makes us more. This makes it more important for narrative medicine to be there in a clinical setup where doctors should listen to the patient's story before imposing or trusting on them that you have this and that and you have to do this and that to get cured. In the last few years, medical humanities has widened its scope to include critical and reflective factors, which offer an expanded framework, like I said, for a more proactive presence. But if we look at the old biomedical model, a patient is seen as an object under treatment. Is seen as a body that is sick and can be managed independently from its mind, family, and social circumstances. So in the past, translators mainly operated within the framework of biomedicine, owing to its economic and political power and prestige. That is why for decades, at least in countries such as Spain, trained doctors with some knowledge of foreign languages were at an advantage in the field of medical translation. And they were leading the biomedical translation market, whereas trained linguists and translators tended to be marginalized on the grounds that they did not have the disciplinary, or let's say the terminological command required to understand and translate biomedical texts in an accurate or reliable way. So the development of translation studies as a discipline and the provision of specialized training programs have meant that more linguists are now involved in biomedical translation, which is a good thing. Now, the relationship between medicine and narrative is as old as ancient myth. In current scientific medicine narrative, as opposed to how do I put it, augmentation or instruction, it is a rhetorical strategy to organize events chronologically, such as the course of a disease or the steps carried out in an experiment in a number of journals. But now physicians have started writing about their patient stories, and in recent times, some authors have expanded the links between medicine and narrative beyond the conventions of biomedical genres. In illness narratives written by patient, we see that the patient are not presented simply as people displaying symptoms that require treatment. We get a glimpse of their social, cultural, and psychological dimensions, which gives us an authentic characters who come to life in the text. More recently, the exploration of the links between medicine and the patient is seen as a person has led to this development of narrative medicine, like I said. Narrative medicine, the theory and the practice, is founded by Rita Sharon, and she tells the story of one of her patients and summarizes the essence of narrative medicine. She tells the story of a 36-year-old Dominican man with a chief symptom of back pain who comes to see her for the first time. And Rita Sharon lets him tell his story, and he talks for a few minutes, and the man starts crying. After a few minutes, he stops talking and begins to weep. Sharon asks him, "Why are you crying?" And he says, "No one has ever let me do this before. Nobody tried. Nobody gave me this opportunity to say how I feel, or how I feel my illness makes my body feel." So he cries. So this is what happens through active listening and viewing the patient as an individual. Sharon was able to understand not only her patient's symptoms from the angle of disease, but also the complexities of his illness. So narrative medicine focuses on active listening to patients' accounts of their suffering rather than merely considering abstract pain as a symptom. Like Sharon says, without the narration, not only treatment but suffering too might be fragmented. So why do we have to remember, and why do we have to narrate this ill story? What is the need of translating the ill body? All these narratives have a clear educational value to help the medical professionals and trainees think more deeply about patients and themselves in relation to their patients. Secondly, they also offer non-specialist rare glimpses of the difficulties experienced by those practicing the art of medicine. And then third, narrative medicine can contribute to humanizing healthcare. And then fourth, there is this life narrative, which is used in the field of autobiographical studies like autopathographies. Patient memoirs, like Lisa's memoirs, suggest that it is possible to construct a personal and sincere voice that empowers others who decide to make their own voice audible. However scattered and incoherent this voice may seem on the surface, the coherence lies precisely in the continuity between personal experience and the way the author uses language in the telling of his own story. And again, the ill body's articulation in stories is a personal task, and the other reason why they should be told to someone is they also have a social task. The obvious social aspect of stories, like Arthur Frank says, is they're told to someone. We write stories so that someone can read them and identify, or let's say the stories act as testimony. Now, science in general and biomedical science in particular have always used words to generate and circulate knowledge, especially in a multilingual and multicultural world. The entanglements between translation and medical humanities points in the direction of reintroducing the human element, which has been eroded both in healthcare and in translation. So this will entail developing a holistic view in which the biomedical coexists with the historical, ethical, emotional, cultural, and let's say the social dimensions of language and communication. It also means putting the patient center stage and ensuring that medical technology and translation, be it machine translation, are always used in their best interest. So medical humanities has shown doctors how can they approach patients in a more sensitive and more human manner. So this is the way forward with medical humanities and translation.
Please conclude it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Using translation as a tool for communication in the professional arena is fully compatible with developing it as an educational tool for health professional and as a frame of critical inquiry about how medical knowledge is generated. So if we talk about this, medical humanities benefit from translation studies and vice versa. What seems to be the original is in fact linked to a long tradition of words, texts, and ideas, and what seems to be the target is no more than a step further in the transformation of that particular text, concept, or argument, beyond which more transformations will occur. Now, to conclude, I'd like to talk about the recent COVID-19 outbreak, medical humanities, and patient-centered care. Recently, we have all seen the COVID-19 outbreak, and it was spreading rapidly around the world. Pandemics show us in a clear and poignant way how our individual bodies are entangled with our collective body and the rest of our society. Biological and societal ecologies coexist. So in this COVID-19 pandemic, the epidemiological and medical debate that has suddenly gone well beyond the expert circles and is let's say uppermost in the thoughts and actions of every member and facet of the society, family health organizations, and the press. We are witnessing the extent to which many aspects of the outbreak lie beyond the scope of biomedicine. So understanding the causes and effects of pandemics and responding to them globally require people to first acknowledge them and then bring about the changes. So this crisis is bringing about a growing awareness on at least 3 fronts. The first one is the limits of science and the need for multidisciplinary research. And the second is the importance of strong healthcare system. And the third is the crucial role of both national and international communication and translation. There will be opportunities for people with imagination and flair to embrace changes, increase knowledge, and find new and more effective ways of communicating within and beyond the medical profession. To end my presentation, I would like to, okay, there is this quote from Hippocrates, who's the father of medicine. In these uncertain times, the rapid technological innovation in areas such as, let's say, e-health and machine translation may submerge the advances made in humanizing healthcare and alter the translator's role and ethos in unexpected ways. So once we get through the initial stages of this crisis, however, there will be patients whose illnesses will be exacerbated by their, how do I put it, their changed personal, familial and economic circumstances. So some elements of patient-centered care may have to be set aside for a time, but what will continue to be needed is the holistic treatment of patients. What will be cherished most of all is the memory of nurses and doctors who in frightening and exhausting conditions were still moved to offer those dying in isolation many small acts of kindness that we have seen in the last 2 years. So I'd like to end my presentation with this quote from Hippocrates, where Hippocrates says, and I quote, "Wherever the art of medicine is loved, there is also a love of humanity." And this is how medical humanities and translation, medicine and humanities can work together and complement and supplement each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Snigdha. This is a new field of research, and you have beautifully connected identity and translation and culture. In ordinary life, we'll be professors or somebody. We have our identities, like we are specialized in this area, that area, we come from this place, that. But when you are admitted in a hospital, your identity changes. And you become just a patient. They will call you a patient, that's all. So very interesting papers and interesting issues, very current ones, emerging areas. Now, I'm sure the audience will have a lot of questions and we have time for discussion. Please go ahead and ask your questions and our presenters will be happy to answer them. Okay, I will start first. Pratisha, what are the texts you are looking at? Have you got any anthology of translation of poems, tribal poems? Pratisha Patel, can you hear me? Not around. Okay. Okay, audience, please ask
Okay.
questions.
So I'm here. So what was
Yes,
your
Pratisha.
question?
Yeah, what are the anthologies you have consulted for your research?
I have chosen Jitendra Vasava. Jitendra Vasava, he's written an anthology of poems, including many poems. It's called Gujaratni Adivasi Kavita. It's translated in English by Gopika Jadeja, and it's originally written in Bhili language. Dahiwali, Dahiwali. and then translated in English.
Yeah. We have also looked at Jane Davis's Anthology, his collection. In other words, here's a collection of poems, tribal poetry.
It's a collection of poems, and also there are many poems he has recited on YouTube, which includes I have translated it in English, which is including Advantages of Silent Civilization. Another one is We Can't Tell Ourselves. Then The True Meaning of Being Wild. Then I Am the Real Seeds of the Womb of the Earth.
Very nice. Okay, this was a factual question, but there will be questions related to concepts and all. Please go ahead, participants.
This is just an answer to Samta, who made a proposal to the.
Hello.
Is somebody else speaking?
Yeah, this is Uma here. Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, go
Yes,
ahead.
madam. Yeah, please go ahead, please.
Yeah, So very interesting papers. I just had another factual question actually to the presenter of the last paper on biomedical translation.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Snigdha. Did you base? I think I missed. I may have missed. I'm sorry. Did you base your study on? I mean, what did you base your study on? What was the corpus? Was it
Medical
any?
humanities. It's illness
Yes,
narratives.
I know.
medical.
But did you base your study on any books or medical reports, or
Yeah.
did you work in a setup of a hospital? I mean, maybe I missed that point. I'm sorry, but could you please explain how you conducted your study?
Yes, okay. My research is still ongoing. I'm working on this field now. So this is from a translation study. So this is a very new area which is emerging right now. It's called translational health humanities. And they are also talking about translational medicine and patient care translation, and also the interpretation and translation which happens in a clinical setup. Like we have medical tourists going from country to country, and all that things keeps on happening. So translation is there, but my research, my study is mostly based on memoirs written by cancer survivors. So this, because it's an interdisciplinary and cross-cultural study, I have relied on texts from medical anthropology and health humanities, and also literature like Arthur Kleinman, Arthur Frank, Veena Das from India. So these are the texts which I rely upon. Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
So they are published books.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So you're not looking at actual medical records or interviews
no,
with
no,
patients.
no. This is a
Okay.
qualitative study where I'm looking at memoirs and
Right.
just research.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
This is a response to Samatha's proposal to the department. We are already running a PG diploma in translation. It's a one-year program, 2-semester program. So anybody apply and join. And apart from that, if your university, your institution is interested in organizing any actual translation workshops too, the department would be happy to help you out. Or if you want to join a course, a short-term course or a semester course, that is also fine. We will help you out.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, there is a comment on the chat box from Uma Maheshwari Jalandaki. Bandaki is not patra. Not patra means utensils or vessels. Jalatanki is not patra.
The question is to
Samatha, I think.
Samatha, yeah.
This is a
because
suggestion.
in the slide that she showed, patra was translated as characters.
Patra means utensils, not vessel.
Patra, yes, patra is.
If the utensil revolves, what can the rice do? That's the kind of thing. Because the rice has to be baked in the utensil.
Yeah, patralu tirgabadite how? Yes, sir. I got it, sir. I got it.
Yeah. Characters and vessels are mixed.
Yes. I mean, the expression was like how the rice is annam ela udukutundi anna words, that is. So there I got stuck up.
Any other questions?
This is a general question, even the chair could take it up. When we are talking of translating marginal literature, mainly we look at the intricacies of certain words and how it is difficult to translate. But that can be said of any text too. But what is so particular to these texts is one thing. And then the second question is also about while talking about Juthan's translation, a remark was made that others will hesitate to translate Dalit literature. But if you look at the translation scenario on the publishing industries, most of the translators of marginal writings into English published by established publications are by the non-marginal translators. So in that sense, they don't hesitate. They do come up because there is a demand for the translation of marginal literature in the academia. Whether in the society, how it is a different issue. But at least in the academic space, there is a demand for these translations. And there is also a visibility for the translator when they take up such translations. So I don't think they would hesitate. They would hesitate in the sense that if something goes wrong, will I be accused as an upper caste? That hesitation is there. But I don't think it is an hesitation that stems from their caste arrogance. So we need to be careful while the neat binaries wouldn't work in such cases.
Yes, there are two issues here. One is that when you have a doubt about a particular term that comes from the marginalized community, because they speak a different kind of language. You have to go, so that is why you have to go to that community and clarify your doubts. If you stumble upon a word and you don't know the meaning, how to translate it, then you have to approach that community people and they will give the right answer. You will get the right answer. And second thing is about Polish language, as Professor Tarakeshwar was saying. Here in one community, in educated circle, certain words will be, the kind of language we use is polished. But in their context, they don't have that kind of inhibitions. It is part of their culture, and even children and adults, they can use those terms. So the community is the best source, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Anand. You brought out the issue of the collaborative translation. When such text you take up which you don't know, you need to collaborate. Whether any community or any language, even if you're Telugu, you can't take it for granted that Patra is characters, but Patra could also be feathers. So even when you are talking about your own language, linguistic text, you need to have collaborations. And a translator is not simply a translator. Translator will also collaborate with many others in the author, and also translator has to undertake research. I think these issues will be taken up when we in the next session, because when we are translating pre-colonial texts, how do we handle those things? Even though I stem from that language, but many of the pre-colonial texts are not intelligent to me even today. So a translator also has to be a researcher while translating such texts. Thank you, Anand. Others can also respond.
Unmute yourself, madam. Okay, madam, unmute yourself, please.
Unmuted. I have unmuted, no?
Yeah, we can hear you, please.
Yeah, this is a question for Snigdha. I was wondering, she said that, these medical humanities or the patients and all are marginalized. And how are they marginalized? And has the studies in medical humanities anyway affected the practice, or what has been the effect in real life?
Yes, ma'am. Now I'm saying they're marginalized because, like Anand sir was saying, once we enter the hospital, they will give us a patient ID card or a number, like 12 number, 13 number. Patients are never asked to tell their own story, like how they feel and what hurts. So in medical humanities, the first basic thing is this difference between illness and disease. What the patient feels, his subjective experience is illness, and what the doctor says is the disease. So if I'm going to the doctor and I feel that my hand hurts or my tummy hurts, so this is the illness, the subjective experience that I feel. But when I come back from the doctor and the doctor says, okay, you are diabetic, you have BP, so that is the term, the disease is given, imposed on me. So now I am no longer a person whose hand hurts, I become a diabetic all of a sudden. So the patient is not given this chance to tell his or her own story. The doctor is not ready to listen. They look at the charts, they look at the the test reports, and then they prescribe medicines. This happens in all the hospitals. Like even if you don't go, then also they're like, oh, we don't need you, we just need your reports to give you prescriptions. So this is what medical humanities is aiming at, to humanize healthcare, to bring back the human to medicine, and let the patient tell his own story and stop marginalizing the patient, stop marginalizing their caretakers too, because nobody ever talks about the caretakers or the mental agony and depression they go through when their loved one is there in the hospital, when their dear one is suffering. So this is what medical humanity is trying to do, to bring back humanities to healthcare. And translation is also, I believe that it is bringing back humanities to healthcare. And in practical daily life also, this is helping, because now people can tell their stories of illness to others. This illness narrative is a very recent phenomena which is happening in India. It was, people were writing about their illness outside India, but we still had that stigma and stereotype attached to cancer, like metaphors attached to cancer of corruption and all these things. But since people have started talking about their illness, since people have started writing, all the celebrities have actually started writing about their cancer in their narratives. People are more vocal about it. They are sharing their experiences and they are drawing hope and strength from each other and each other's story of survival. And they're no more scared of going to hospital or telling their neighbors that, okay, I have AIDS or cancer. They're no longer scared of that stigma and stereotype which the disease brings with it. They're no longer shamed. So this is something which is happening in the practical life that medical humanities has brought to their own life. So this is what I think about it.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add a question?
Yeah.
This is Satyendra.
Okay, hello, Satyendra.
Okay.
Hello. Thank you, Asnak. That was a really good presentation. I just wanted to know, like, have you taken only physical ailments, only physical disease patient, or any mental disease patient also in your text? And one more thing, have you taken any translated works like from any other, from Hindi or Odia or any other? Just wanted to know, because you have talked about the translation, like the words should be like these memoirs should be translated to another languages, and maybe that's why I was really curious. Have you taken any translated text?
Okay, what was your first question again?
It was like, have you taken only physical disease patient like cancer and all that, or any or mental disease also?
No, mental disease is a different thing because they cannot narrate their own story. Somebody has schizophrenia, somebody has depression. They cannot sit down and write about their story. That
no, after that big overcoming from schizophrenia.
Yes, that is that would come under survivor narratives. That won't be illness narratives. Like a person is going through something and translating his ill body, right? So mental illness is different from chronic diseases like cancer. I think that. And coming to, I haven't taken any texts on mental illness. Specifically, I work on cancer memoirs.
Because I have read a lot of OCD patients after recovering. They have read one of the schizophrenia best book I have wrote about it is what it is named as I Never Promised You a Rose Garden.
Okay. Yes, one more is also there. Fallen Standing by Reshma Baliyappan. I will send it to you. I have that text. Many texts are there. But my research is on cancer memoirs. So I started reading this in Jubilee Hills, Apollo, Hyderabad. The oncologist is there. His name is Vijay Anand Reddy. He has actually written a book which is I Am a Survivor. I don't know if I have it. Yes, okay. I don't know if I can see. So this is the book, I Am a Survivor. And it's an anthology of patient narratives which he has collected from his patients. So from here I started. And then I thought, okay, if the doctor is narrating his patient story, it would be great if the patients can narrate their own story. So I research and work on
because
cancer.
We'll conclude there.
Yeah, one thing I think I was reminded of a movie called Anand way back when, Anand, and it was made on cancer.
Yes.
So, I mean, are you looking at some movies which are based on this kind? I mean,
yes, ma'am. Actually, I'm trying to incorporate movies Anand, Ashai, and there are some other movies also, but I haven't started reading on
There was also another movie on I think AIDS, perhaps. Yeah. And Akhiyon Ke Jhorokhon Se, there was another movie. I think that was also based on cancer.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. There are movies on cancer, but I haven't looked at it. But I will read on it and I will look at it. Like
you need to look it.
Yes, ma'am. And for Satyendra, there are texts which I can't remember the writer. I think it's Maheshwari. It's called Mayan. It's in Rajasthan or Hindi. And there are also some texts in Hindi which was written by survivors, cancer.
Surkant Tripathi Nirala also wrote. It's in 1920 he wrote when the Spanish flu came. He wrote a lies miss. He wrote in Hindi, but it was translated. I think you look at it. Its name is Life Misspent. It's a really good book.
Notes.
Sure.
Because you know each other.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Because we'll be starting the next session. Thank you very much. It was very exciting All the papers were research-based and on emerging areas, a lot of things to learn. And most of them are our own students. So it is a harvest season for the translation studies department. Our own students, they have groomed students and they are coming back and presenting papers. They are coming back as doctors and so on, professors. It's a heartening to see them back and doing good work. And those who haven't done studies from our university or our department can also be appropriated as our students, because the translation studies department has conducted this huge seminar, and through this they are learning and they are seeking advice and consulting teachers and all. And this is a platform. This is like a classroom. We appropriate you as our students. So congratulations, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. We shall move to the next session, perhaps. Over to the organizers.
Thank you all the participants for their wonderful presentations. Before we move on to the next session, I would like to express my gratitude to Dr. Anand Mahanan for chairing the session and leading an interesting discussion. Thank you, sir. I would also like to thank all the presenters and participants for their presence and contribution to this session, making it a success. Once again, thank you, everyone. The plenary session will start in a few moments. Thank you.
We can begin.
Should we start the next session?
Yes, please.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the third plenary session of the online international seminar under the theme Translation as Reconstitution, Issues of Self, Canon, History, and Memory in India, conducted by the Department of Translation Studies, the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. I'm Shilpa Ravindran, a research scholar from the Translation Studies Department, IFLU, Hyderabad. For our third plenary session, we have with us the very distinguished scholar, Professor Vilcheru Narayana Rao. We have an AV prepared for his introduction. To the AV introduction.
Dr. Vilcheru Narayana Rao served as a professor in the Department of South Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was invited to teach in the Sanskrit Academy, Institute for Advanced Studies, Hebrew University, Jerusalem. He was also a visiting professor at the University of Chicago. Apart from teaching for more than 50 years, he is also a well-known short story writer and translator. Some of his notable works are Narayana Ravu Kathalu, short stories, Eluru, A Poem at the Right Moment, Remember Verses from Pre-Modern South India, The Demon's Daughter, a love story. He was selected as a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Hebrew University, Jerusalem. He received the fellowship of the Institute for Research in the Humanities from University of Wisconsin-Madison. For his contribution to the field of translation studies, he was awarded A.K. Ramanujan Prize in Translation jointly with David Schulman by the Association for Asian Studies.
To chair this session, we have another distinguished personality, Professor Vanamala Vishnata. Professor Vanamala Vishnata is an acclaimed scholar and translator. She has taught English language and literature for over 4 decades in premier institutions in Bangalore. Deeply engaged with various facets of Kannada culture, she was the Associate Director, Katha Regional Academy Center, Bangalore, an initiative that promoted Indian literatures in translation. She also worked as Honorary Director, Center for Translation, Sahitya Academy, New Delhi. Professor Vanamala Vishnata served as a member in the National Translation Mission as well. The Life of Harish Chandra, her translation of a medieval Kannada poetic classic in the Murthy Classical Library of India series, is a landmark publication. Dr. Vishnatha's translation with Professor Sriram Pandikal of Indira Bhai, the first social novel in Kannada published by Oxford University Press in 2019, is yet another milestone in presenting the literary treasures of Kannada to the global readership. I welcome Professor Vanamala Vishnata to the seminar and to chair this session. Welcome, ma'am. You may please unmute your mic, ma'am. Ma'am, please unmute your mic.
Yeah, I've unmuted now. Okay, what about the video?
You need to switch on video, ma'am.
Yeah, but for some reason, the video is not starting. So, but doesn't matter. You can hear me, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I shall welcome you through Akashavani right now, all of you, and Professor Rao. And we can go ahead with the session, and in the meantime I'll fix my video. Okay, so like all of you, I'm also looking forward to listening to Professor Rao, who is one of the rare scholars who have given an Indian slant to Indological studies, which has largely been a bastion of Western scholars. And as a scholar and a translator, and as a scholar translator, he has brought, to his scholarship to bear on the translation, and the creativity of his translation to bear on his scholarship. And this way, he has enriched both activities in his work. And therefore, I really, and as a person who has collaborated with several scholars, in producing, great poetry in translation, great works in translation, who's worked with translators like Ramanujan and David Schulman. He has brought a keener edge to his translations, especially pre-modern writing, and has set us a very good example. And therefore, I'm very, very happy to be an Anuvadak. An Anuvada, one of the senses of Anuvada is to follow after, Anuvada. So I'm very happy to follow after the example that he has set. And I welcome him to this session, and I eagerly, wait to, hear him and see him. And welcome to you, sir. Thank you. Hello.
Professor, yeah, he's back. I think yes, he's back. Yeah, he had lost his connection. He's back, I believe.
Join back.
I just saw him. He's trying. Yes, he's back. VN Rao.
Professor Narayan Rao.
Yeah.
please unmute your mic? Sir, can you please unmute your mic?
You can, the host can unmute, I believe. Sir, could you please unmute your mic?
Okay, call him up and ask him to.
Yes, I'm calling.
Kokila, find out what
Yeah,
kind
I'm
of
calling.
project, what kind of device he is using and help him.
Yeah, I'm calling him. He had lost his connection. I sent him the link again, so he could join through that link. But I think that he is unable to. There's some problem. Sir, sir, మీరు కనిపిస్తున్నారు.
Now video is also muted. Earlier video was unmuted.
Oh.
We lost him again.
Oh, we lost him again. Yes. I think Kokila is on phone talking to him.
He has joined.
Yeah, I think even if the video is not working, audio would also be fine.
There is no audio now. I can only see video, which is muted.
I think audio has to be unmuted.
Tarkeshwar, were you able to hear what I said earlier?
No, I don't think so.
None of
We could hear, ma'am. We could hear you.
No, we could hear, but he couldn't hear.
he couldn't hear. Huh?
Yeah.
Audio is working, but video is not working, or vice versa?
I can't see the audio device. Only video device I can see, and it is muted.
Oh.
Is there anybody helping him there?
Kokila, find out.
Yeah, I'm just in speaking to him. I'm speaking to him.
Yeah, he has somebody with him there to help him out. Just, or is he alone? Earlier he was there and he was listening to. He told me I'm listening to Snigdha right now.
Yeah. He will be there. He will be there in a minute. Actually, he is unable to. I mean, this on the phone. He is unable to manage that. Okay, sir. ఇది మీరు లెఫ్ట్ సైడ్ కి అన్నారా సార్? జాయిన్ మీటింగ్ అయితే మీరు మళ్ళీ అవుట్ అయిపోయారట.
మళ్ళీ వచ్చారు.
లెటిన్ చేశారు సార్, లెటిన్ చేశారు. ఇప్పుడు మీరు చేశారు. ఇప్పుడు మీకు కనిపిస్తుందా సార్?
Kokila, his audio device is missing. Can you keep the phone on? Let him speak to the phone. We can listen to him.
Phone on.
And somebody will play the PPT here.
Your phone, Kokila.
My phone is fine. My phone is fine. Okay.
No, through your phone.
Let him speak to that.
కనిపిస్తున్నారు కదా, ఇంకేం కావాలా సార్? అంతే. ఇప్పుడు మీరు వచ్చేసినట్టే. అయితే ఇక్కడ మీకు లాస్ట్ కింద అన్మ్యూట్ అని ఉంటుంది చూడండి సార్. కింద స్క్రీన్ లో కింద మీకు అన్మ్యూట్, స్టార్ట్ వీడియో ఇవన్నీ ఉంటాయి చూడండి సార్. ఎండ్ లో లాస్ట్ లో
left side, bottom left corner.
Taresha,
sir,
అదే స్టార్ట్ చేయండి. మరి అక్కడ క్లిక్ చేయండి, వచ్చేస్తుంది. అది క్లిక్ చేయండి. దాని పక్కనే లెఫ్ట్ సైడ్ లో అన్మ్యూట్ కూడా ఉంది. అక్కడ అన్మ్యూట్ కూడా ఉంది. దాని స్టార్ట్ వీడియో పక్కనే లెఫ్ట్ లో అన్మ్యూట్ అని ఉంది. కనిపించట్లేదు.
Join video, join mic, audio.
Join audio వచ్చేసేయండి. కరెక్ట్. జాయిన్ ఆడియో.
And he has to select the mic.
కరెక్ట్ సార్. జాయిన్ ఆడియో త్రూ అది ఉంది సిస్టమ్. ఎస్, జాయిన్ ఆడియో త్రూ మైక్ అని త్రూ డివైస్ అని వస్తుంది. అది జాయిన్ ఆడియో క్లిక్ చేయండి సార్ మీరు.
It's waiting, it's connecting. Wait, Kokila. But it's not connecting. There's some problem there. Let him speak over the phone. We will play the PPT.
Yes, sir. We are all here. We all also can see you. But the thing is, you have to join audio. Join audio ఉంది కదా, అక్కడ మీరు క్లిక్ చేయండి సార్. దానికి
Kokila, let him speak over the phone.
ఓకే సార్. మీరు ఫోన్ లోనే మాట్లాడండి. అట్లనే మాట్లాడండి సార్. ఓకే. Are you able to hear? I don't know.
Can you see the slides?
Is he audible? అదే సార్, మీదే. మీరు అన్మ్యూట్ చేయాలా?
Kokila, mic is not missing there to unmute. So leave it. Mic is missing. There's some problem with the mic. He has not joined.
Okay. No, he was saying that his mic was available that time. Join audio, it was available for him. But
Ma'am, after that you have to select the mic. So it is again other options are there. So better he speaks on the phone, and anyway he can see the slide.
Are you people able to hear, listen to him?
Yes.
Sir, చెప్పండి సార్. మీరు మాట్లాడండి, ఇట్లానే మాట్లాడండి కదా సార్.
Okay. He can see the slides, right?
సార్ మీకు స్లైడ్స్ కనిపిస్తున్నాయా సార్? స్లైడ్స్ సార్. అయితే మీరు చెప్పండి సార్, చెప్తూ ఉండండి సార్ మీరు.
Okay. I don't know if you're able to hear me or not.
No, we are able to hear you, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is Vanamala Vishnata there?
Vanamala.
Yes, sir. Very much.
Okay, she's
here, and I welcome you once again. Thanks.
Is he audible to everybody?
Yes, he is.
Okay. Please go ahead, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. What I'm trying to do is that translation is a foreign concept to India. We never translated anything in India.
Yes, sir.
Go down to the next slide. You can see we have divided sentences by word, sound, and meaning. If you take the sound and meaning as your basic things, you have three kinds of text. Are you able to see the slides?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We are able to see that. Yes.
Three kinds of text: Veda, Purana, and Kavya.
Maybe next slide, Tarisha. Yes.
Veda, it commands like a king. It's Prabhu Samhita. Purana is Mitra Samhita. Advises like a friend. Kavya is Kasta Samhita. Teaches you like a girlfriend. Now,
next slide.
Texts that are sound primary, Veda. This is never translated. Purana, they're meaning primary. So you can translate it Purana because you don't have to follow the sound. The sound is completely overlooked. Only take the ideas of the Purana and tell it in your own language. That's why texts that are meaning and read the text, that's all. So, the word that we have now for translation called Anuvada, or maybe other words in other languages, they're all completely borrowed from English. We have no such word in Indian language. But without translation, there's no literature. In many Indian languages, we need to translate somehow or the other. Take, for example, the case of Telugu. Nannaya, I hope you are able to see the slide.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We are able to see, sir.
Nannaya, the 11th century, who translated the Mahabharata, translated quotations, called Adikavi as the first poet in Telugu. Let's now see what Nannaya Rajaraja asked him to do. Jananuta, Krishnadvaipayana, Munivrushapa, Abhita, Mahabharata, Satya, Nirupita, Artham. Artham Erpada, Junugunarati, Kumadika Dishimai. He didn't translate it, he didn't ask you to translate it. That composing Telugu, the proven meaning embedded in the Mahabharata, spoken by the great sage Krishnadvaipayana. You have a powerful mind. This is what Peter Nannaya was asking poet Nannaya to do. So he was not translating. He was the meaning embedded in the Mahabharata and writing in his own language. And what are we doing when we are translating? Was the poem ever translated? The answer is no. What am I doing when I translate Telugu poetry to English? Develop a new protocol. Translate the reader. Telugu is an English word fast. Think tactically and thematically and culturally. So what are we doing? Violating a tradition when we are translating any other language into Telugu or any other language. Poetry. For example, if you take to develop a new protocol, here is a Telugu verse. Everything you see that in red is a big compound, a Sanskrit compound. Patadanikanche Bhuvisuru, Amparatumpi Sirasarachari Patala, Muhuluta Dahanga Taranga Budanga, Nispanas Putalatana Rupa, Paripulla Kalapa Kalapi Jalam, Katakajarat Karedu Karakampita Salam, Ita Shailam. So what you do is take long Sanskrit compound, longer than in any other Kavya. So you break it up into its meaning and translate into its meaning, each one as a separate one. Each thing separately into a separate sentence. You do not try to translate compound. There is another interesting thing in Telugu. You can take a whole story and say it in one verse. Here, Pratibarsha Vasantoksava Kutukagata Kavi Nikara Kumpita Kavya Romancha Visankita Shutuvanta Puravatu Pravadana Rasika. That's an address to the patron. Your hair stands on end with excitement when you think of the poems sung by good poets who came every year for your spring festival. You're skilled in comforting your wife when they suspect that you're aroused by thinking of another woman. The whole story is composed in one verse. So, what does a good translator do when you're translating a poem? A great poem more than one poem. A good translator sees in the poem a hidden meaning that the native residents may not be aware of. Once a translation is made, the poem is going to another meaning which comes out of the text. And even the native speakers will say, hey, there is this meaning. I never saw this before. Therefore, a good translator opens the poem and picks up the meaning which is not immediately seen by the native readers themselves. Okay? Here, for example, go to next slide. So when a poem is more than one poem, you take that poem and pick up that poem which is not even read by the native speakers and bring it out and show it in your translation. So your translation opens the poem to them and they can see something there. Before. There is another interesting text, translatable text. There is what's called picture poetry, Chitrakavya. How does that work?
Chitrakavya.
Here. This is the way in which a cow urinates. And the poem is written following the line in which the cow urination goes. And what do you do with it? Don't do anything. You take it and reproduce it in your book. Write the syllables as they are there and tell people that's how you read. And then translate it. You're more than that. Here is what's called a Kundali Nagabandha. How a snake will turn around when it is twisting in whatever way. This is Nagabandha. And to write your thing at the head and come down all the way, go round and round and round and go at the end. And what's interesting about this is there are letters that you traverse more than once. That is, when you read them, you come across the verses more, again and again. That's one way of remembering God. So you don't translate it. Just reproduce the picture, write the letters in it, and tell people how you look at the letters. Traversing it more than once, coming across the same letter again and again, and thus remembering God in more than one way, or more than once. So what are the other untranslatable things? World literature is such a big thing. Is there such a thing as world literature? We still don't know. Dominant language tries to translate everything into its own idiom and say, this is world literature. But world literature, there is no such a thing as world literature. Unless you recognize one or the other languages as dominant language of the world, and your poem goes into that, and you think you are part of the world literature. There is no such a thing as world literature. There is Telugu literature, Hindi literature, etc., etc. One thing we have, there is a common culture for Indian literatures, and therefore you probably can approximate what is written in Kannada, in Telugu, in Tamil, and in other languages of India, because they have the same shared culture and shared syntax also in some cases. Now, what's interesting is that there is an Indian literature. When you take the syntax of Indian literatures into serious consideration and see how the syntax can easily translate into another syntax. In fact, what we try to do in translation, as I say all the time, you translate the reader, not the text. Translate the reader into your language, and then the reader understands your translation. So that's the only way we can talk of translation. There's no other way. Other ways, I don't think are really good. They're not even approximations of what's said in other language. Translations are impossible in many, many ways, especially in their poetry. With a short story, some possibility. With the novel, there is a possibility. But all that is to be distant from the original. You can never understand the original and you have to read it in the original language. So, translation is impossible. Thank you. Did you follow what I tried to say? Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yes, yeah.
Any questions?
So Dr. Rao, and is this, are you in the middle of your talk, or is that a teaser of a question that there cannot be a translation?
I don't follow if it's a question. I'm not able to hear clearly.
Sir, can we throw the discussion open to questions and comments?
Sir, ma'am is asking, can we open the session for questions, or would you like to continue?
There's no continuation. I told possible.
Okay, so shall we? Okay, translation is possible. Impossible.
Yes. Okay. Okay, that's a very provocative.
Read the original language and read it in the original language. We did not translate Kalidasa. We didn't translate Bhavabhuti or any great poets of India. We didn't translate them. We read Sanskrit and read them in Sanskrit. In fact, you can easily see if there is a Kalidasa poem in any Indian language at all. No. Mahabharata and Ramayana were translated again and again because there are Pradhana texts. They are not poetry. They are only stories. You can tell them in any way you like. There are so many Ramayanas in India. Each one says simply, I follow Valmiki, but nobody does. So you can translate Artha Pradhana text, not Shabda Pradhana text. Shabda cannot be translated. Read the original language and read it in the original language.
Okay. But the obvious question that comes to mind when I hear you say this is, you have yourself translated Kshetraya and other poets into
You're
English.
absolutely right.
How did that become possible, sir?
Into English. So anybody who reads it in the original language may think, okay, there's something close. But one reads in the original language thing is not good, is not translation. So we tried. We translated, I translated, as a matter of fact, from Telugu and Sanskrit into English. But what we did is not the words, it's the meaning of the poem we translated. So when you take the meaning of the poem, you're lost a lot. But interesting is, there are two ways of saying it. Poetry is that which remains in translation. Poetry is that which is lost in translation. Both are right. You do something, you gain something. So you may call it translation, and you may enjoy it still. But that's not really the original poem. Okay?
Yes, the point that the soundscape of poetry is harder to translate is well taken, but if you kind of say Shabdarthe Saitav Kavyam, Shabda is a little difficult to translate, but Artha is possible. So you would consider that as a lesser translation then?
Translation is impossible, but translation should be done. It's both. There is an impossibility, but there is a necessity. Okay? So we are translating out of necessity, not because we know translation is possible, especially poetry.
Okay. Are there any questions from the others, comments, questions on this?
Apparently, no.
No, Tarkeshwar has raised his hands.
Thank you for your patience.
Tarkeshwar, sir, there are some questions. Tarkeshwar has a question, I believe. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, ma'am.
All right.
If Shabda and Artha cannot be separated, then there is no translation. If the translation is a process of separating the Artha from the Shabda and putting it in another Shabda, then translation is impossible. Because the Artha is immanent in the Shabda itself. You cannot separate the two. And many philosophers have taken this position.
Okay.
But if you forcefully take out Artha from the Shabda and try to put it in some other Shabda, the meaning will change. That's what he is saying. So it is a necessary thing, but it's a violent activity. So in that sense, it is not possible to retain the Artha as it is, because the Artha will modify itself according to the Shabda that you are going to put in there.
I agree.
But translation is a process where change is inevitable, and therefore the attempt is to recompense, compensate for what has been lost in other ways, in other modes, and in other words. And therefore you create an alternative patterning of sound, an alternate soundscape, as it were, to represent the original sense of the whole text. And therefore, I would beg to disagree with this position. But I was also equally curious to know from Professor Rao, you were saying that only what is possible is only to translate the reader. How would you do that, sir?
You did it very well in your own translation.
Sir is saying you did it very well in your own translation.
Thank you very much.
And I enjoyed your translation as if I'm a native speaker of Kannada.
Yeah. Sir says he's a native speaker of Kannada.
He's not, but yet he...
You are the one who showed.
Okay, sir is saying as you as a native speaker of Kannada, you have done it.
No, but therefore, I would like to submit that you have yours, like there are different notions and definitions of translation. And yes, if you treat Shabda and Artha as inseparable, then, if it is, for instance, Coleridge says, it's right words in the right order. What is poetry? Right words in the right order.
Order,
yeah. So for each language, there is a different order and what is the notion of rightness of the word. Therefore, if you can translate the effect of the original in some way in the translation, that is what one is trying to do. Isn't that so?
Am I talking to Vanamala?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, your translation is wonderfully done because you translate the reader, not the text. The reader goes into the original language and through your so-called translation understands the original language. That's your achieved. Okay? But you have to translate the reader. The reader has to become Kannada. Then they can follow what you're trying to say.
Yeah, while it is true that I have tried to follow the Kannada rhythm in English, but the language of communication is still English, right? And therefore, I think it is as much the reader and the text coming together, where you establish a common ground where they can meet.
In effect, you translate the reader.
But I would.
The text. And then that reader understands the text in your translation or through your translation.
So, thank you. But
Sir, so you are saying that you translate the reader. And so you mean to say that we are not translating the text?
I don't know if I'm able to make myself clear when I said translate the reader. The reader has to move into your language.
Okay, okay.
The context of your language. See how the language works in original. And then think in that language. And then even though it's called English, it is still a text which is different from English.
If I may just intervene, I find that this statement by Rao sir is probably one of the most beautiful statements on translation practice. And I think I will carry it with me for a very long time. And it encapsulates perfectly what I have been instinctively feeling as a translator of Marathi into French for a very long time. When sir says we need to translate the reader, I think what I understood by his statement was, sir, please do correct me if I'm incorrect, is that we need to dislocate the language into which we are translating as much as is necessary so that the reader is dislocated from his geopolitical and cultural location and brought into the world of the, let us say, the source culture or the source text. I think that is how I understand the statement. And I would just like to appreciate the statement once again. Thank you.
Can I also say something, sir? Sir, when sir, when you say poetry, you don't translate because it's difficult to separate the abda and the sabda. Okay, so but when you translate a poem, maybe you are coming up with a new poem. You are creating a new poem which resembles the old, but it's not the old one. It's a new poem on the basis of the old one, which has some resemblance to the old. I think this is why Roman Jacobson said, in principle, poetry cannot be translated. It can only be transcreated. Creative transposition is possible, but translation is not possible. But people have been, scholars have been translating for years poetry. So we take it for granted, poetry translation. Of course, as you say, like as a reader of the source text, you have to translate. And it's not the same thing that you find in your translation. It's something different. But it will have some resemblance to its source, and one can say, oh, this is a translation of that text. People can identify a translate poem as a translation of something else. So that kind of similarity or resemblance still remains, even if you go by Adda and you take your own form, sign and its features, etc. This is what I feel, sir. In your poetry, that's what we can feel. Even your Annamaya songs, we can still see, we can identify, oh, this is the translation of this poem. And I did some work on your translations of Annamaya's Gita's, Annamaya's, what we call, Kirtanas, God on the Hill. Yes, sir.
I would like to raise another issue. That is, one of the most insightful, observations that Professor Rao made, in Bangalore, in his series of talks in Bangalore International Center a couple of years ago, was that in pre-modern writing in India, there is no text which is fixed, which is stable, which is consistent. The text is always in a state of flux, and that is because it is what the readers and the community and the culture make of that text. Therefore, the text is a very unstable and a very temporary, of the moment kind of an experience, and it's an experience in a culture and a community, and therefore the onus of meaning meaning making or meaning conveying is not just on the text, but it is also on the community. Now, in the context of today's world, when we are translating a pre-modern text in this sense, into today's text where it is in cold print, how do we face this challenge of bringing that community here to another community which is entirely different? Especially for at least, like when Tagore's poetry is translated to Kannada, it can, the sound can also come into Kannada. Many of his poems are sung in the same tunes that he had composed in Bangla and in Kannada. So we have not only, it's like many of the, film songs which were dubbed, right? Between Hindi and Kannada, or between Telugu and Kannada especially. Dubbing becomes possible because the languages and the communities are so alike. But when the challenge comes when we do it to a non-cognate or a very diverse kind of a language. So what would you say about the notion of community, sir, when we are translating from, let's say, Telugu to English?
That is what I was trying to say. Translate the reader. Give the context of your poem, your syntax, your culture, and give it to him. Take this culture, take this syntax, take this how it works, and then read the poem. Then you understand something of it. But without there, just sit in your English world and try to understand Indian poetry is not possible. You have to change your mind, change your thinking, change your culture, change your imagination, and then read the poem in translation. Then you can understand. So that's what I'm saying. Translate the reader.
Yes.
Okay?
There's a question.
Yes.
There's a question in the chat box. Ma'am. Vanamala ma'am.
I don't see the chat box. Can you
Shall
please?
I read out? Shall I read out? Yeah. So it's like, it is, I think, a question from Krishnaya Konda. He says, how to retain the actual feeling or thought of the writer while translating from one language to another?
First of all, you have to become the poem yourself. If you don't love a poem, you can't translate it. Why do you love the poem? Because there's a culture around the poem of which you belong. And you take that and then take that culture and tell your reader in the other language, hey, this is the culture you don't understand. This is how it works in that language. So move in that culture. That's what I say. That's the need. If I sit in my English world, if I belong to English world, I couldn't understand a thing about India. Or think about Indian culture. So to change. When I read Shakespeare, not much of it, for that, yeah. But when I read Hamlet for the first time, and I said, stupid poem, what is poem? So translate it. Somebody who killed her husband and married somebody else, married brother, it's a poem, it's day, and you want to make it a great play in your culture. I had to understand something about British culture, Indian, and then try to see how this poem works. Why does Hamlet become so incapable of acting on anything? Why is it so important? So for that, from my point of view, it's not a poem, it's not a play, it's nothing, it's nonsense. That nonsense becomes sense to me when I move into the British culture, the Indian, and I move into what their culture was, and how the poem actually becomes an important poem for them, and it becomes an important poem for me. So in effect, I have to translate my culture into their culture. So before you translate your poem, tell them about your culture. How does this become a poem in your culture? This is why it is called a good poem in Kannada or Telugu or Tamil or whatever Indian language I'm talking about. Until then, my translation will be useless for anybody who reads it from their perspective. So what I'm trying to say, not just translate the whole culture around the poem and then give it to your reader. That's what I say, translate the reader. Okay? I hope I'm making sense.
I see a hand going up here.
I told you when I read
Is it
Hamlet,
Tarkeshwar?
that's nonsense. How can this be a good poem? How can this be a good story? How can this be a culturally important one? It took a long time for me to understand British culture. Then I understood, yeah, this is a good poem. This is a good play. This is a good character. Hamlet has very, very meaningful character. It took a long time for me to understand that. In the beginning, I dismissed it as a bad play. Same thing goes for Indian literature translated to English. They immediately dismiss it as bad. You have to translate them. You have to teach them your culture, how it works, why you put poem in your culture, what is the atmosphere from which the poem arises. They understand the poem. Okay? I don't know if it makes sense or not.
Sir, yeah. How does one do that, sir? How
you
does
have to
one?
write
Yeah.
a essay about your poem. Tell them what culture this poem comes from.
Okay, maybe
Why
in
is a poem for the people of that culture? And try them. That's exactly what you bring the reader into the poem. Then the reader understands the poem. Okay?
Can I ask a question, ma'am?
Please.
Yeah. You were saying you have to become the poem itself. I mean, people say that if you have to translate poetry, you have to become. You have to be a poet. They say that only a poet can translate a poem.
That's absolutely right. You have to be a poet to be able to translate poetry into any other language. What is poetry in that language? For example, what kind of English do old people know in India? You know, the people of applications, people of petitions, people of commands, orders, and all that. But there is a language of poetry in English that we are not familiar with. That language of poetry in English is something you have to master. And then bring that language of poetry into language of your own. Then they understand, yeah, the language works this way. So English that I know, or at least I thought I knew, was not necessarily English of literature. I took a long time for me to learn that English in which literature is produced. That's a different English. And bring your Telugu or your Sanskrit into that language. So the language which you know is not the language of literature in any language. English that I learned is not English of literature. Same thing goes with anything else. So when we translate something, you should know the language of the literature of that language. And then you have to create an atmosphere from which translation is produced in that literature. That atmosphere should be brought to, this is the atmosphere in this language in which the poetry is created here. So when you move in here, when you understand it, then you can see translation is possible. So translation is not word, translation is not what we learned in English here. So Indian English translations fail that way because we do not know the language of literature of that language. There's a different language. Same thing in Kannada, in Telugu, in Tamil, in any other Indian language. There is a language of literature. And that is the production of culture. Okay?
So, sir, what would you call your own quote unquote what we understand or what generally is understood as translation? You have translated yourself, no? So, what would you call them?
We translated about 20 books. David and I myself. Yes, it took a long time for me to see what is the language of literature in English that I have to learn and to which I have to translate. Example. So try to bring everything in this language into that language in that translation. Try to decode it. So translations fail because people do not realize that there is a language of literature of that language and the context in which poems are produced in that language. And unless the context is produced and written about, people don't understand it. For example, every book we David and I and myself translated, we wrote a long afterword. Why is that afterward? Because without that afterward, the reader does not understand the context in which this poem was written. That afterward tells the reader, that's where we translate the reader. After you read the afterward, and then you say, oh, this is how I to go in to understand this poem. Okay? So you translate the reader's culture into your culture. And then you can give that poem to him or her. I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. In fact, I have found that in my presentations, if I can kind of present the poem in Kannada or even through song, through Gamakam. The Gamaka is an art form from in Karnataka through which, older poetry, ancient poetry was presented shared with audiences. So that mode of sharing is immediately reaches listeners and readers. And after that, if you present the text comes alive. Therefore, that's I would agree with you entirely on this. That there should be other modes. Transmediality is such an important. Different media can be used in order to enliven what is in cold print. And this is a very good way of translating the reader, I would submit.
Thank you.
Can I just add something to this? I mean, just a query or maybe some clarification. I mean, I've heard Tarkeshwar saying that you can translate a poetry without even knowing the meaning or without knowing the knowledge, language. You can translate poetry without, we heard him saying that they conducted some workshop wherein people without even knowing the knowledge language, they could translate.
Yeah, if they understand the sounds and make sense of the sounds. For example, I was trying to work with
but then what happens to the meaning then? Isn't the meaning lost?
See, for example, in poetry, there are two different things. Sound and meaning go together. You can't separate them. So reproduce the sound, you reproduce the meaning. Okay? So sounds are important in poetry. So how do you produce equivalents of the sounds in the other language? Not equivalent. Make the reader understand why the sounds work this way in this language. Then you say, okay, I can see that. Then I can understand how it works. So therefore, there is a recent translation which I worked with Arshita Kamath. I translated it with her.
Theft of a tree.
Parijata Paharana. Parijata is a kind of a tree. Great tree. But then we translate simply theft of a tree. People ask me, why do you translate simply called the theft of a tree? It's not a tree. It's actually not more than a tree. It's Parijata. No, never mind. Take it as theft of a tree and read it. And you can see how you can move into that language. Move into the culture of that theft. Okay? So don't simply produce equivalents. Produce equivalents of meaning and sound. And we don't know that. We don't know that in many languages. English has become our second language in some sense. And we spend a lot of time learning English. Show me any European, show me any American who learns an Indian language, same way as we learn English. We spend a whole lifetime in learning English. They don't. They don't even get the meaning of sounds properly. And therefore, they don't understand what translation of the Indian language should be or should be. So it's not something that should be one into the other. Bring the person who is reading this Telugu poem or Kannada poem or Tamil poem into that culture and then produce the songs. That culture is completely understood by them. As I told you when I read Hamlet for the first time, I read a horrible text. What kind of a culture can produce a text like this? It's a bad text. It took a long time for me to understand the culture of Hamlet, the culture of dance, and yeah, it's a good poem. And Hamlet is a great character. That's what I'm trying to say. Let your reader in English understand the culture context, the meanings, and the sounds in which, in your language, home works. Then they can move to read. So that's what I mean by translating a reader. Write a long essay after translation and show how they have to really understand it. Okay? That's the purpose of writing the afterwards. For each of the translations we made. Okay? I hope I'm making sense. I'm just talking. I don't understand.
We are able to follow you, sir. We are able to follow you.
So that's what we have to aim at.
Yeah, Ajay has a question.
You read it into your culture. Then give this poem to him. Then they say, yeah, there's something in it. And the great example would be me reading Hamlet. They say it's a bad poem. How could it be a poem when a wife kills her husband and then marries somebody else? And the son, therefore, sees all that, but can't do anything about it. I think I'm losing battery in my cell phone. Let me see if I can start it. But anyway, that is what I tried to say.
Okay.
I hope I make sense. I hope it has some changes something in your thinking about translation.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. That it kind of provoked us to take your question further, to kind of deepen the thought behind that provocation. And Ajay Kumar has had a question. Would you like to come in, Ajay?
Okay. Can I close this?
Ma'am, I have posted my question in chat box. What I have told is Ramanujan also shared the similar notion about translation. What it tells is a translator hopes not only to translate a text, but hopes against all odds to translate the non-native reader into a native reader.
Yes.
So my curiosity is whether are you influenced by, I mean, to VN sir, are you influenced by the notion of translation put forward by A.K. Ramanujan?
Thank you. Can I close?
Sir, yeah, sir is asking whether he can close. Yeah, sir, Tarkeshwar has a question, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, Tarkeshwar.
Yeah, Tarkeshwar, please come in.
Tarkeshwar.
Can you hear?
You're not audible. You're not. Your voice is breaking, Tarkeshwar. No, your voice is breaking.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Maybe after a few minutes. Okay, now?
Yeah,
I think it's better. Yes. Sir, your position is incommensurable in the sense that if it is possible to take the reader to the text, if it is possible to translate the text, then the text exists. But the text is in flux, is always in the making. If text is in process.
He is unable to hear, it seems. Can you, Can you?
The best thing is to stop here and let.
Okay. I think.
Another discussion.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we should defer to this, moment. Sir, I said some very nice things about you, sir, earlier. Maybe I will write that to you, what I said earlier.
Thank you.
And thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for being here. Yeah, I think ma'am wants to say something.
Yeah, I just very briefly wanted to say how, despite all the technical snags, one very important thought has, we have been able to focus on. I think from one session, if there's one important thought that we can take home and think about, that session is successful. And Professor Rao, in his own very, very forceful way, has made us think about this. And so, as always, he's been a very stimulating speaker and thinker. And I would, express my deep sense of satisfaction at his way of presenting and making you think. Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanamala.
Yeah. Thanks to the organizers. Yeah. For giving me an opportunity to chair this session. However, not very, not to everybody's satisfaction, but I don't know what.
Maybe Tarakeshwar wanted to say something.
Okay.
Tara, would you like to come in, Tarakeshwar?
No, there are one or two things. One is, if we assume that the text is in flux,
yes,
then it is not possible to even.
No, Tarakeshwar is saying if we assume the text is in flux, right?
Yeah,
That's
then,
what he said.
then
Then
You have to make the text accessible to the reader and therefore transform the reader into your culture. Bring the reader to your culture. Translate the reader means that. When you translate the reader, you understand the text.
So let the reader do the work.
Thank you.
okay, sir. Okay. I think, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
I think he needs. His battery is going down. It seems.
So I think we should be closing this session. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Tarakeshwar, for inviting me. Thank you, Kokila, Lakshmi.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Very welcome.
Maybe
Studies,
maybe we can take some question. Tarakeshwar's question.
Go ahead, Shilpa.
Okay. So I'd like to thank Professor Velchuru Narayan Rao for this informative lecture despite the technical glitch. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd also like to thank Professor Vanamala Vishnata for chairing this session and leading the insightful discussion that followed. And I thank all the participants for their contribution to this session. Thank you all.
We'll see you
Can we
tomorrow
call
again.
it today? We can see, we'll meet tomorrow again at 10 a.m. That is